I'm at my parents' house with my mother drinking coffee. I had decided to drop by unexpectedly to spend some time with her since I had worked a lot the weeks before and hadn't heard much from her. So we were talking when the intercom starts ringing. My mother goes to see who it is, picks up the receiver, and the expression on her face changes. She seems stressed, but she opens the door anyway. She then comes back to me saying it's a guy she met on Facebook that she hasn't seen for a year and a half, but we have to say that we are going to my grandma's so he won't stay long. I'm starting to think that it's weird, but we hear knocking, so my mom will open the door while I stay in my chair overlooking the entrance. I see a rather tall man coming in with a normal build, bald with small glasses. As soon as he entered the apartment, I felt the atmosphere change. Something oppressive was squeezing my chest. He kisses my mother and turns his head towards the living room where I am. Then he frowns when he sees me, as if he was surprised to find me here. I don't like it. His gaze is empty and disturbing. He says hello to me from afar and walks into the living room, grabs a chair and sits down. My mother then asks him what he's doing here and why he arrived without calling first. I'm sorry, I didn't take my phone. Actually, I'm coming from the hospital next door. I escaped, and since you told me you lived around here, I decided to stop by and say hello. At first, I thought he was joking, especially since he said it with a big smile. But his eyes were really weird, and his attitude too. My mother laughed nervously and asked him if he was serious, to which he replied that he was. He even gave us the name of the town he came from and told us how he ran away. He tells us that he was outside with 3 doctors on a terrace, that the doctors came in before him while telling him to follow them, and that he took the opportunity to leave, passing over a hedge that overlooks a road where there is a bus stop. He got on the first passing bus and found himself not far from our house. He didn't know our exact address, but thanks to my mom, who gives her real name on social media networks, he knew his last name, and he searched all the interphones in the neighborhood before finding out where we were. While he was telling this story, I went on Google Maps to check where he said he was coming from, and everything matched. The hedge looking over the road, the back terrace, the bus stop. But most of all, it's not just any hospital he escaped from, it's a psychiatric hospital. So I started to get really scared for myself, but especially for my mother. We have an escapee from a mental hospital in our house. He then explains to my mother that if she hasn't heard from him for a year, it's because he came back there a year and a half ago after he lost his wife and all of his money, but he didn't linger on it for very long. It was way too much for me, so I got up and said I had to go to my room. I went in. The door wasn't closing, but I took my phone and I called my best friend, who is a security guard and who lives 20 minutes away by car. I tell him what's going on, and he decides to come, armed with a knife, just in case. When I hang up the phone and go out of my room, I see the man in the corridor near the door. He tells us that he's going to have to leave because people are probably looking for him, and that he has to go to a friend's house, but he has to take the train. We say goodbye to him, and he leaves, but that's not all. I then explained to my mother what just happened, that she was crazy to have given her name and address, even approximate to a stranger on the internet, and then she tells me that last year she was at his house with my father, that his wife was there, and that they all had a great time, so she didn't consider him dangerous. I still tell her that someone you have only seen once is not someone you can trust. My buddy arrives then, sooner than expected. We decided to call the hospital to make sure what he said was true, and especially to warn them that someone might be missing from their institution. So we call, and the secretary picks up. We explain our story. She seems surprised, so she puts us on hold, and she checks it out. When she comes back, she tells us that he is not in his room anymore, and that all of his stuff is there, and that they hadn't noticed he was gone. It had been more than 2 hours since he had escaped, but since the guards had seen his belongings when they passed by the door, they hadn't worried. She, however, warns us that he is a dangerous psychopath who had a crisis after his wife left him, that he can be extremely violent if he is upset. At that particular moment, I only could think about one thing. What would have happened if I hadn't been there with my mother, if she had been alone with that guy? She told us that they were going to do whatever was necessary. We asked her if we could be kept informed when they found him, but she told us she had no right to give us that kind of information. We then raise our voices and explain that we shouldn't be afraid of him coming back every day, and she apologizes but can't do anything about it. We hang up the phone and decide with my friend to go for a walk around the neighborhood for several hours and the next few days to see if he's still there, but we never saw him again. My friend Joe told me this story a few years ago. Joe was a nurse at one of the hospitals in my area, working an overnight shift at a psychiatric ward. It was late at night, and some of the other staff had brought in a woman who was having a psychiatric break. She wouldn't stop screaming, no matter what they did or said. She also was screaming nonsense, no words, just straight up screaming. So they decided at first to let her kind of just blow off steam. They figured she would stop screaming eventually, so Joe was put on watch duty for her. She was put into an isolated room with a camera in it. He was put in a position where he could see her, but also could see her on the camera footage in case he needed to. When they put her into the room, his peer told him, "She's in there for now. We will check up on her in a while. For the time being, watch over her, but don't look at her. Just don't. It'll make it worse, and it'll just be better if you watch her through the cameras." The woman continued to scream for hours and hours. High-pitched, horrifying screams. He said eventually he noticed that her screams were sounding really messed up and gurgling, which made him decide to look at her through the glass, since it was rather alarming to hear her voice suddenly change like that. He looked over and saw her staring right at him, still screaming, and she had managed to spew blood all over the window on the door because she had been screaming so hard for so long that her throat started bleeding and flakes of blood were flying everywhere. It was like something out of a horror movie, and I can only imagine it was as such. Eventually, they had to sedate the woman because she was starting to shred her vocal cords from the insane amount of screaming. To this day, I still get so spooked thinking about how horrifying that experience must have been, but also horrified that something like that could actually happen. I'm from Scotland, and my workmates took a trip to Newcastle for a friend's hen party. A hen party is the Scottish version of a bachelorette party. We'd went to a few pubs and clubs that night and settled on the Livello nightclub. I have autism, so generally I am not very good with my social skills, but they insisted that I go along with them and that it'd help my confidence. What would happen to me this night would ruin me forever. Unlike other people, I can hear sounds and noises a lot different from other people. My friends were dancing to the loud music. For them, it was fun. For me, it was just white noise to an extreme level, a very high-pitched tone ringing in my ears. I really regretted going out. I just sat there while they danced, and I'd seen this guy from a distance hanging from the balcony. Luckily, some bouncers caught him. When he fell, I was relieved but felt disgusted at the same time that someone could get himself in such a state. He was removed from the nightclub. My anxiety levels had skyrocketed, and I couldn't handle the music anymore. I told my friends that I felt sick and wanted to head back to the hotel. So they tell me to stay safe and phone a taxi, to which I did. I was waiting outside for more than an hour in the pouring rain. No taxi had appeared. I phoned back countless times, but they said the taxi service was busy and it'd take a while to get one to me. The doorman showed me directions to a taxi rank and said I'd get one quicker if I joined the taxi queue. I'd walked down, taking his instructions. It was very dark and rainy at this moment, and eerily quiet. That was until he popped up from an alley, the guy from the balcony. He was pissing in there. He looked like your typical English hooligan, shaved head and topless, and some horrible torn denims, and a beer bottle in hand. I continued walking, and I could sense him following me. "Oi," he said. "Oi, you." I don't know why I did it, but I turned around. "Do you got the time?" I told him the time, put my head down, and kept walking. He tried to catch up with me, staggering a bit because he was drunk. "Where you from?" he asked. "Oi, I'm talking to you. Where you from? You one of them Markhams?" A Macomb is a slang term for someone from Sunderland, Newcastle's sworn rivals in football. I'd said no, I'm Scottish. He'd rambled on some more, but I chose to ignore him. "Oi, listen, I am talking to you." He reached his hand to grab my shoulder and nearly tripped up. I'd laughed a little because I couldn't help it. What the fuck are you laughing at, you Scottish cunt?" he said, reaching for me again. By instincts, I started to run. I just didn't feel comfortable with him there. He started to chase me. "Oi, get back here, you slut!" He kept shouting. My high heels had fell off, and I was running in my bare feet. I couldn't run anymore because I was out of breath and my feet really hurt. I went into a phone box to protect myself from him, and he tried to barge the door in. I'd gripped onto it so hard, putting all my weight onto it. He started ranting at me. "You fucking skank, wait till I get you. I'm gonna teach you a fucking lesson." He started kicking the door, and it almost moved. I was screaming for help, and there were some passers-by, but they ignored my calls for help. He kept kicking at the door and nearly got in. I jammed my fingers, but still held on for my life. I then used my feet to hold it even tighter. He threw his glass bottle at the door, and the booze had spilled everywhere, soaking the whole phone box. I was worried it was going to smash the glass. He'd have definitely got me by then. "Hey, you fucking cunt, why don't you go back to Kiltland and eat haggles and whatever shit you people eat?" He started mocking the Scottish accent before chanting, "England, England, England." I just couldn't stop myself from crying, and I kept screaming for him to leave me alone. I could actually feel my throat get sore. I'd screamed so much. He then pulled out his penis and started rubbing it against the glass and said, "I'm going to make you suck, this dirty slapper." After another aggressive struggle, he managed to get his hand in and grabbed me, but I'd kicked the door shut against his arm and jammed his fingers. When I kicked it again, he was reeling in agony and had blood pouring out of him. Some passers-by had tried to warn him off, and he pulled out his penknife from his pocket and threatened them with it. He got into a brawl with two guys from the group, and I took the opportunity to run away while his back was turned. I remember my bare feet ended up with glass in them, but I was in so much shock. I just kept running. The rain never stopped pouring. I spent the next hour at the taxi rank, freezing cold. I'd lost my jacket when I ran. I can't remember how I'd ended up without it, but I had blood pouring from my feet. I remember I could see it mixing in with the raindrops on the concrete. The taxi driver asked if I was okay. I shivered constantly with fear as well as the cold, and I couldn't stop crying. I could barely talk, but managed to tell him about my ordeal. He told me to go to the hospital or to the police, but I just wanted to go home at this stage. Had to settle for my hotel room, of course. After a trip to the hospital, I'd gotten 4 stitches in my feet with antibiotics to avoid infection. I'd went back to Scotland the next night without my friends. I was too scared to do anything. I reported him to the police, but nothing ever came of it, and I never heard anything back from them. This happened when I was 16 years old. I was driving home in my new car. It was raining in San Diego County that evening and was dark out. We lived a bit away from the town's houses with bigger yards, no stores really, etc. As we drove past a larger intersection with a gas station and nothing else for a few blocks, I saw a man sitting in a wheelchair on the side of the road, alone, in a hospital gown, in the rain. There was no hospital anywhere close by at all. I froze for a bit and then yelled at my mom to look. At the last second she did, and she saw him too, which thank God, because I would have been sure I had made it up. Again, a man in a wheelchair in the pouring rain. Hair was plastered against his face, in a hospital gown, alone. I still think about it to this day, and if I ever have to go back to that town and drive past that intersection, I get shivers. No hospitals for miles. There weren't any businesses besides the gas station for at least a mile. I'm now 29 years old, and this happened 13 years ago. If you're new, go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, as it really helps me out. And if you are already subscribed, welcome back and thank you for subscribing.